right, Acts chapter 10, you'll notice as you look at the page that it's divided up into a few different parts. We looked at the last two parts, really. But the first two parts of this chapter deal with God preparing two men for a meeting that is coming up. The first man is Cornelius, and the second is Peter. They're in two separate cities, and over the course of a couple days, God is doing independent work in each one of their lives in order to bring them together in what will become a historic meeting, not just for the church, but a redemptively historic meeting. That might be the first lesson right there, is that God is very much the orchestrator of events here. And even though both Cornelius and Peter don't really know why God wants them to meet, they walk by faith and walk by faith in obedience, even though they don't have all the answers. That in and of itself is a good lesson for us to learn. But let's talk a little bit about Cornelius. We know some interesting things about him. We're told right away in verse 1 that he was a centurion. This is a technical term because it referred to the number of men he would have had command over. He would have had command over, as the word suggests, 100 men. And if this reminds you of another centurion, it should. Jesus, we're told in the gospel accounts, met a centurion who asked him for help because one of his servants was very, very sick. And Jesus commended this man, this centurion, this Roman officer, for his great faith that exceeded many of the faith of many Israelites in Jesus' day, as he pointed out. Here again, we have a military officer, tough fiber, disciplined, devout, friend of the Jews, whom God looks upon favorably. And in this particular case, when this man is praying during the 9th hour, we're told, it's about 3 p.m, which was one of the traditional times of Jewish prayer, an angel comes to him and tells him about Simon. And this man immediately dispatches men to go and to collect Simon and bring him to Caesarea. Okay, that's day 1. That day closes. The next day, we're told in verse 9, now we're in a different city, in the city of Joppa. Interesting historical note. One of the early stops of the prophet Jonah was Joppa. But rather than obeying God's call to go and to share the gospel with Gentiles, what does Jonah do? Goes the other way. Whether that just is a providential, interesting note, or whether that should cause us to lean in a little more closely to see what Peter is going to do, I can't say. But I found that to be an interesting intersection. And lo and behold, Peter is also praying at a different time. We're told he's praying during the 6th hour, and you may see in your footnote, the 6th hour is noon. He's on the roof, which is probably the most comfortable place to be in this climate, and a place where he can get away. And after he's ordered lunch, yells down the ladder that he's hungry and he wants lunch, he goes into a trance. The Lord gives him a vision. And the vision is of a sheet that's descending from heaven with representatives from the animal kingdom upon it. Animals, we're told in verse 12, reptiles and birds of the air. Similar classification that we find in the book of Genesis. I mean, the point here is it's every kind of animal is before him. And that would mean that there were some that as a Jew, he would know were good to eat, were clean, were kosher, some unclean, forbidden for a Jew to eat. And the command, which takes Peter by surprise, is kill and eat. Eat whatever you want. And Peter says, no way, I never have eaten anything unkosher, non-kosher, and I'm not going to start now. And God's reply is, what God has made clean, do not call common, do not call unclean or common. And this happens 3 times. This is something that's interesting in this is a bit of an aside, but one thing we notice in this narrative that's just a good insight into how we read our Bibles is the amount of repetition that goes on here. So not only is his vision repeated 3 times, but Cornelius' story is told 3 times. Peter's story is told twice. And that might feel a little redundant when we're reading through it. Like, we already know this. Why do we need to know this? But this is a clue for us from Luke. This is really, really important. And just like teachers need to repeat the important stuff so it gets in, teachers need to repeat. So God is repeating these things to us because this is a significant and very important moment in the life of his people. One other connection that's interesting here that you might want to make note of is this language about God making food clean that was previously unclean. This echoes something Jesus says in Mark chapter 7, when he says that it's not what comes out of a man, it's not what goes into a man that makes him defiled, it's what comes out of him. And Mark adds this aside in Mark chapter 7, verse 19. He says, by this, or thus, Jesus declared all food clean, all foods clean. And theologians point to this as well as what's going on here, as well as other places in the New Testament, to say that the food laws of the Old Testament have been abrogated by Jesus. They no longer apply to God's covenant people. They were there for a time, they served a purpose. But now that we have Jesus as our high priest and Jesus as our righteousness and our holiness, those food laws are no longer applicable to God's people. And I say that's a side note because this isn't really about food, is it? This is really about Peter's mind being changed about people, because he applies this same language of clean and unclean when he visits Cornelius' house later, and he says in verse 28, but God has shown me that I should not call any person common or unclean. So let me apply this for us, or maybe give you some questions to discuss as a family, or just think about as an individual, or maybe call a friend, or in your small group you could wrestle with these questions together, pick one and talk about it. One question: are we seeking God in prayer during this time of isolation? Are we seeking God in prayer? Both of these men meet God, or we should say God meets them when they're praying. And Cornelius gives us a helpful hint here. He is following essentially the regular times of prayer for the Jewish people. And that might be a practice we want to adopt if we haven't already. Pick a time every day when we stop to pray. Maybe we say, before I look at a screen, before I check email, before I check Facebook, or whatever our routine is in the morning, first thing I do, now that the weather's beautiful, is I grab my cup of coffee or my cup of tea and I step outside and I pray, just a morning prayer of gratitude to the Lord. That's how I start my day. But I'd encourage you just to pick something simple that you can begin to implement to enrich your prayer life. So are we seeking God in prayer? Secondly, what is God teaching you right now? Peter, who had spent 3 years with Jesus and was a leading apostle and teacher of the church, had something to learn, something big he had to learn that God was teaching him. It didn't just come about through the vision. It didn't just come about through the Spirit speaking to him directly. It came about through his circumstances as well. We notice at the end of chapter 9, and in this chapter as well, that Peter is staying with a tanner named Simon. And a tanner would be somebody that most Jewish people would look down upon, wouldn't stay with, because he handled unclean animals, and this too was a violation of the law. And so it seems maybe God is already softening Peter's heart on these issues, not to mention the fact that he's hungry, and God uses that time in his life, in his day, to speak to him about food. So when I say, what is God teaching you, I do want you to ask yourself, what is he teaching me in his word? What is he teaching me in my times of prayer? What is he teaching me in my circumstances? Those are important for us to ask as well, because the Lord, who is Lord of all, teaches us through conversations, through our cravings, through the people we're with, through the places we go. So are we paying attention to what God is teaching us? If I were to ask you today, what is God teaching you right now? Would you have an answer? I promise you he's teaching us something, teaching you something, but have you thought about that? And then thirdly, let's be grateful for what we see going on here. Most, if not all of us, ethnically speaking, are Gentiles. And so Cornelius is one of us. You might even say he was the first one of us. And we should rejoice that God has made good on his promises from the Old Testament, that he would include the Gentiles in his covenant family. Well, there you have it. Acts chapter 10, a great chapter in a great book. I hope our short time together has been encouraging to you and gives you lots more to think about, lots more to pray about. Remember those 3 questions. Are we seeking God in prayer? What is God teaching you? Are we rejoicing that the gospel has come to Gentiles like us? And I hope you're able to have a great week or rest of the week whenever you're watching this. We're praying for you guys. We miss you guys. God bless.
Come weary saints, though tired and weak, hide away in the love of Jesus. Your strength will return by his quiet stream.